Good evening, everybody. My name's Corey, and I get to kind of end out our sermon series called Mine. And we've been in this series for, I think it's been 5 weeks now. So thanks for journeying with us about that. And just thanks for being here tonight. It's just such a joy to be able to look around and worship together every single week. And you could be doing a million other things. There's something about a game later on tonight, but you're here before it. So thank you for that. Like I said, we're going to dive into week 5, but this whole sermon series has been addressing the question of how can I make a faith that's my own, not a their kind of faith, not a somebody else told me kind of faith, but a faith that's mine, a faith that's real, a faith that I get to experience in my life, not somebody else just told me their experience. So we said from week 1 till now, we said, the first thing was, we got to do something with the knowledge of our faith. We've got to act on it. We got to live differently, not just knowing all the things, but doing something with the stuff that we know. We talked about the need for our community. We have community groups as part of Anona Nights that we're going to be kicking off here soon. Again, another season of groups, but we need each other. You can't do faith alone. You can't have your own faith just by yourself. You have your own faith in relation to other people in community who have their own faith as well. Then we said, you got to serve. There's a direct connection between growing your faith and serving. And Casey last week talked about the need for personal connection with God, not just the crowd time, not just big corporate worship, but where have you seen God personally, in the quiet, in the moments of your day-to-day life? How are you intersecting and relating to God on a personal level? And then tonight is the last one, and it all goes back to our mission statement for our church, for what we call here at Anona Nights, and this is our mission statement for this service. And we were really intentional about it. We didn't want to just be a church service where people gather in a room. We said, what's the point? And long story short, we landed with, the point is to help people have a personal faith of their own. We said, there's a bunch of different ways we do that. So we said this, and it's our mission statement that pops up on the screen behind me. It says, real people coming together to find and follow Jesus and impact the community. Each week of this sermon series is embedded in this mission statement. Funny how that kind of works out. And then tonight, we're focusing on that first part, real people. What does it look like to be real, to be vulnerable, to ask questions, to be honest with each other, to take down the facade, to take down the front and say, this is me, this is who I am at my core. And what does that mean for our faith? How does being real help you develop a personal faith of your own? And so we're going to dive into that in a couple different ways, in a couple different aspects. We're going to look at a story in Scripture, but to kind of get us started, I wanted to just get everybody in a specific mindset of, put yourself in a moment where somebody was explaining something to you. Have you ever been in a situation, maybe it's a new job, maybe it's orientation, maybe it's somebody's explaining something really detailed that you need to do, or some instructions about how to play a game, just anything that's pretty detailed that somebody's explaining the details of it. Orientation for a new job, something you don't understand. They maybe use big words, I'm guilty of that. Somebody will use a big word and they'll go, you understand? Yeah, sure. I got nothing. So put yourself in that moment where somebody's explaining something to you, they get to the end and it's pretty complicated and they go, you got any questions? Are you good? Are you ready? Are you ready to do this thing by yourself, especially your job? If you've been on orientation for a week or whatever at a job and then they go, you got it? And you go, inside you might be going, I don't know. I have some questions. I have some doubts. I need some clarification. But a lot of times we hesitate. We don't want to be the only one to raise our hand to go, actually, I have a question. Especially in large groups of people. If they're explaining something to a large group of people and they go, everybody get it? Yeah, no. You don't want to be that guy that goes, no, I don't understand. So we don't raise our hand. Nobody's comfortable being that. We worry that we're the only one that doesn't get it. We're worried we're the only one that's asking the questions. And we have a reputation to uphold. Maybe that's what holds you back. But if we could, just for tonight, and maybe this is a little scary for you, maybe you don't want to get vulnerable, but I will. For tonight, if we could let our guard down, if we could let that facade go of I've got reputations, I don't want to be the only one asking questions, and just go, I think we all have questions. And I can tell you, I've got questions. I've got a lot of questions. I've got a lot of things that I don't understand. There's things that I couldn't explain away. There's things that I struggle to connect the dots with about life, about culture, about faith, about the way families work, about schools. Just the list goes on. I've got questions, and maybe you do too. You watch the news, you scroll through Facebook, and you see all these different news articles or whatever articles on Facebook, and you go, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. The way that the world is working and these news stories and these things we see, I got questions about how that can be happening and how this can be happening over here. I've got questions. And let's not be afraid to ask that, because we want our church to be real. We want our church to be filled with people who aren't afraid to ask questions, who aren't afraid to go, hey, I don't understand how this thing happens over here and how this happens over here. What happens? How do we have faith in the middle of that? How do we have culture in the middle? I just don't understand. I've got questions. But why do we feel like we have to have it all together? When it comes to life, when it comes to faith, we feel like we have to have everything set up just perfectly, like we can't have questions, we can't have doubts. I got to have my life together because everybody's watching. And so we don't ask questions. And maybe we don't ask because maybe questions make us think. Maybe it makes us dive a little bit deeper into life or culture or faith or whatever. Maybe we're worried that it's going to lead to even more questions. So we just don't ask. Maybe we have the fear of like, well, I don't have time for all that. I don't have time to put in that kind of work. We have fear that we might not get a complete answer. We might not get the answer. We might not get the answer that we want. We might not get the whole thing. And if we ask that question, what if it just all comes crumbling down? So we just don't ask. But I think that's crazy, because especially at church, we talk about some pretty incredible things, some pretty incomprehensible things, and some of them include like a God that we can't see, but we say we believe in. We believe in a God that is so abstract and a mystery that we can't see, but we believe wholeheartedly in a God that we can't physically put our eyes on. We believe a story in the Bible about a guy named Moses who parts a sea. It's like a big body of water, like, I don't know how big, like it's just like the Tampa Bay, whoop, right down the middle, dry land. Like, how did that happen? We talk about blind people becoming unblind. We talk about sick people becoming unsick. We talk about our whole faith centering on a guy who dies and is raised back to life, and nobody has questions about that. It maybe feels a little sacrilegious to go, well, I want to know more about that. I believe it. I'm in. I understand parts of that, but I want to know more, and I wonder how some of that happens, and I believe it, but I have some questions. But we're afraid to say that because sometimes it feels like the whole thing's so fragile. That if you ask some deeper questions, not the surface level stuff, but if you get in deep and you start asking some deeper questions, what if it all just crumbles? What if you ask the wrong question and it pulls the cornerstone out of the entire thing and it all crumbles? So we stay on the surface level. We ask questions about friends or families or parenting or schools. We ask questions at that level. Maybe you ask a little bit deeper of like, well, tell me a little bit more about creation. Tell me a little bit more about miracles or a flood, or tell me more about some of those deeper things. But then we maybe hesitate to get way down deep because we're afraid of some of the questions and what it's going to do of like, is God real? Is God good? If God's good, then why this? And is Jesus who he says he is? We hesitate and we pretend like we don't have those questions because we're worried it's going to all come crumbling down. But if we're honest, I think we all have things at all those levels. You can look at the surface level and go, I've got some questions on the surface level. I've got some questions like right in the middle where it's a little touchy to ask, but we ask anyway. And I've got some deeper questions where I look around and I go, some things just don't add up. So I don't know how to process that. I might just pretend like they don't exist, but I've got some doubts. I've got some things that I want to know about. Maybe you were told, well, just believe. Just believe. It's okay. Just believe. I know it's crazy, but just believe. Maybe you were told God will get mad. Like, don't question the big man because he'll strike you with lightning. Maybe you were told being a good Christian means like just feeling everything with your heart, but turning off your brain. And don't think about the stuff that you can't connect the dots with just yet. Don't think too hard. Just believe. That's what a good Christian does. Just believe. But the tension is, and the reality is, and I promise I'm getting somewhere with this, those questions never go away. We think they will. We'll pretend like, oh, that part doesn't matter. I'll just stay surface level with my life. I'll just stay surface level with my faith. We pretend like that doesn't matter, but it does. Because it comes back when life happens and situations in life bring up some of those questions and you go, I had that question a while ago. I just pushed it down and here it is again. Maybe the questions come back when you meet new people in life and they start sharing their life experience or their beliefs or their life or their culture, and you go, well, I had questions about that and now it's coming back. Maybe it comes back when life just smacks you in the face and the world throws a curveball in your plans and you go, man, I wonder how that works. I have doubts about that. I question that, and we have all these questions and ideas come back that we try to push down. But I want to ask us tonight, what if there's a better way to think about our questions? What if there's a better way to look at our questions and think about, well, let's not push them down. Let's be real. Let's be honest. Let's be bold enough to say, I've got questions. And what if the questions thing is actually part of us growing in our faith and growing in our faith personally with God? What if God's not intimidated by our questions, but instead God welcomes our questions? What if God can do something with our questions that we never thought or we were afraid that it wouldn't do in our lives? And so that's what I want to camp out on a little bit tonight. We're going to look at a story in Scripture about a guy that had some questions. And we're going to look at some principles about, well, what do we do with our questions? How do we do that in just a little while? But I think what we'll actually find is that we have a lot in common with people in the Bible. We have a lot in common with them because they were filled with questions. There was a lot of stories about doubt in the Bible. People doubting themselves personally and people doubting God. People looking at Jesus or thinking about God or getting an idea or getting a call from God. Like God says, hey, you could go do this thing. And people go, no, God, not me. Like I doubt me. I'm not good with words. I'm not good with that. I'm not like, no, I got questions. I can't do that. And so there's stories about that. There's stories where people doubt God, where God promises something and people sit back and they go, yeah, I know God promised that, but I don't know how he's going to do it. So let me actually do this thing over here instead of trusting the thing that God said he was going to do. And so there's doubts all over the Bible. And so if you're finding yourself in that camp, I would love to just share story after story of look at all of these examples and look at God's response in the midst of that. And I think too, people in the Bible got to sit face to face with Jesus. They got to sit across the table and look at Jesus in the eye. And those people still had questions. They were looking at the guy and they still had questions about what he was doing. So surely we're going to sit here and we might have questions ourselves because the people that looked at Jesus had questions. And so the story tonight that we're going to look at is in the book of Mark. And it's a story about a dad and his son. And his son is really, really sick. The son was sick with just some unexplainable stuff, like just crazy illness, like scary kind of sickness stuff. And Mark's writing this down so that we get an example of these questions and we get a real life example of like, what did this dad do when his life and his family was crumbling? And so the dad's trying everything, really scary. I'm sure the dad was scared. I'm sure the son had no idea what was going on. He's traveling around asking all these people and the dad is freaking out. And he runs into Jesus. And the disciples and the religious leaders kind of pull this guy and his son away from Jesus, and they're trying to figure out what to do with him. And I don't know if he should get close. I don't know if they should do that. He might just be too far out there. He might just be whatever. And Jesus says, no, let him come in. Let him come in. Jesus welcomes him in, and he has a conversation with the dad, and he goes, well, how long has your son been like this? And the dad goes, well, since childhood, forever. I've tried everything and nothing seems to be working. I'm getting frustrated. This is like the Corey translation of it. He didn't say all that, but I bet he's probably explaining, I'm frustrated. I'm doubtful. I don't know that I'm ever going to get my son back. It's been since childhood. And then he says this to Jesus, and it's the first verse that we're going to look at tonight. In Mark chapter 9, he says, but if you can do anything, take pity on us. And I don't know about you, but I read that, and just a little side note, as we get ready to continue in this story, this is after Jesus has done some pretty incredible miracles. This is after Jesus has calmed the raging storm, after Jesus has healed a ton of people, done these crazy things, and the Father goes, if you can do anything, take pity on us. And I look at that, and I sit back, and I go, well, come on, dude, like have a little faith. You're looking at Jesus, if he can. It's Jesus. Come on. But then I put myself in the dad's shoes and I go, well, the dad was tired. He probably lost hope. He doubted he was ever going to get his son back. He wasn't sure what was going on. And he's probably about to give up hope. And he goes, if you can, could you do anything? Take pity on us. Come, I don't even know anymore. If you can, take pity on us and help us. And what's Jesus' response? Does Jesus strike him down with lightning and say, you had no faith? Does Jesus turn his back? Does he get mad? Does he go, if you can, you don't even know me, like whatever, man. If I can, I can. He doesn't say that. Jesus does what only Jesus can do in response, and he simply looks at the dad and he repeats the question. And he goes, if you can, Jesus said, everything is possible for one who believes. And he didn't repeat the question in a guilty way to say like, listen, if you can, I can. Like, he didn't have that attitude. Jesus replied in a way that only Jesus could by repeating the question to meet the dad where he was. The dad was in the middle of questions. His whole life was probably filled with questions. And Jesus sits down and he goes, if you can, I hear you. If I can, please take pity. If I can, I can, you know? And I just picture Jesus putting his arm around the dad and going, if I can, I hear you. I hear you have questions. I hear you're struggling. I hear you have doubts. If I can, I know you're questioning everything, but let me tell you, everything's possible for one who believes. And he meets him right in the middle of the doubt, right in the middle of the insecurity and in the questions. And I don't know about you, but for me in that moment, if I was that dad, I'd be putting my foot in my mouth and just backpedaling like crazy, like, oh, what did I say? If you can, of course it's Jesus, he can. But what I love about the dad's response is he didn't backpedal at all. He owned the questions. And immediately the boy's father exclaimed in the next verse, I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief. The dad owned it. It's a weird thing to say. I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief. It's basically saying I do believe, but I don't. I want to believe this, but I still have questions. I want to have faith, but I still have doubts. And for that dad, I need this to be true, Jesus, but I just am not sure. And then I think about us, for you and for me, maybe for us, it's I do believe, but I don't want it to, or I'm afraid for it to affect my plan or my life too much. So I want to believe, I do believe, but I'm afraid, so I'll just stay surface level. I don't need it to be personal. I'm good, just surface level. I believe, and this guy knew what he should say. The dad was probably thinking in that moment, yeah, I do believe. That's the right answer. The right answer is, yeah, I believe. I have no questions at all. But what happened instead was the dad was real. Just like I hope you and I can be real tonight. He didn't ignore his questions. He claimed it. And he said, I do believe, but help me with my unbelief. And Jesus was totally okay with that answer. And then after that, Jesus acted. Jesus healed the boy, not in this huge showy way, but through that conversation of, I believe, help me in my unbelief. Jesus acted. And that's kind of how questions work. You get questions in the form of conversations and relationships. You put your arm around each other and go, I just don't understand this. Help me understand it. You ask questions back and forth, and we get to act from those questions and from those conversations. And so what if we just did that with God? What if we asked questions with God, had the conversation, and got to see the action from those questions? Because I don't believe that God made that dad's son sick. But I do believe that God took that moment of questions and doubt and upset to reveal even more about himself to his dad. It shows that God cares about that dad and his son. And I believe if God cares about them, God cares about you and God cares about me. And God can show up in our questions, in our uncertainty, in our doubts, in the things that we don't understand about the world or our culture or our life or our faith. God can show up in those moments and show us more about himself. He can meet us in our hurt, meet us in our questions. He can sit next to us and go, yeah, you got questions about that? I hear you. I understand, and I'm with you. And maybe that's why when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment in the world is, what's the greatest thing that we can do with our faith, with our lives, anything in our lives, in our culture, in our faith, what's the greatest thing, Jesus? What's the thing that will make our faith great? And Jesus says, we did this whole series on it, so I don't want to just teach it because hopefully you know it and hopefully you've learned it from the past series. It was called The Greatest. You can watch it if you missed it, but Jesus says this as the greatest commandment. It's going to pop up on the screens, and if you'll say it with me all together, it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Great job, audience participation. Nice job. What I love about that, though, and this is what I'm getting at, all of those questions where Jesus meets us in our questions. Jesus meets that dad and his son in the, if you can, take pity. If you can, help me with my unbelief. I believe, but help me. Jesus tells us in the greatest commandment, it's not all just about heart and soul, but love God with your mind as well. Don't turn off that part of your brain. He doesn't say, hey, this stuff is unimaginable. Life is hard. Like, it's fine. Just turn off thinking. Just believe. He goes, no, love God with all your mind. Use your mind to know God better. And so if you want a faith to call mine, if you want a faith to call your own, lean in. Be honest with your questions. They might be really big questions. They might be questions you might not ever really get the full and complete answer to, but God's big enough. God's big enough for our questions to reveal more about himself to us each and every step of the way. Lean in, notice what God's doing. Let the words of that Father and Son be our prayer of, I believe, but help me with my unbelief. Help me with my questions. Help me with my life. Help me when things don't add up. I believe, but help me. And your questions don't have to be the cornerstone that pulls out and everything crumbles. If anything, I would argue our questions build a stronger foundation around our lives and make that cornerstone of our faith in our lives even stronger. Last week, Casey talked about Elijah, and he was looking and standing in the presence of God in the midst of the fire and the storm and the earthquake, and God was in the whisper. God was in that quiet moment where he had to lean in, where he had to be intentional, where he had to listen close. And I want to ask us this week, don't let fear hold you back of being the only one asking questions, because you're not the only one asking questions. But instead, let that be our response like Elijah. And let our personal time with God, like we talked about last week, be the foundation for where we start to lean in, where we listen to the whisper, where we discover more about God and see God in the little things in our lives. See, part of a faith that's mine, part of a faith that's your own, is asking questions. It's diving in, it's wrestling with the things we don't understand, not just ignoring it and pushing it aside because I'm just supposed to believe like a good Christian. No, dive deeper in your faith. That's part of a personal faith that takes it from their faith of ideals and principles to a faith of your own, where you've experienced it, where you've lived it, where you've wrestled with it, where you've gotten dirty with it. That's what makes it your own. So here's the big idea for tonight, and the thing that I want to sit on our minds as we get ready to leave here. Let your questions bring you closer to God. Let your life, the ups, the downs, let all of that bring you closer to God, because part of having your faith of your own means letting your questions be a doorway or a window into being honest with God and having that conversation and seeing more about God in the process. It's a window, or it's a doorway into the realness of God affecting your everyday relationships. It's not just a set of ideals that you sit in the corner somewhere and you don't ask questions or you don't wrestle with. If that's all faith is, it's not really real for you. But when faith becomes real, you pull it out and you let faith affect every single day. And that's my prayer for our church. That's my prayer for you and for me, honestly, that we can say it's not a faith that's theirs. It's not a faith of ideas or principles anymore. It's a faith that's mine. Because when a faith becomes personal, when faith becomes real for you, it becomes so much more impactful for you and your life and your family and your friends, and it allows our church to have a great impact in the community outside these walls too. That's what we're about. That's what we hope for you and for me and for our staff, that we can be so invested personally, that we can be so real with each other, and that we can be real and honest with God, that our faith gets personal and gets bigger and has a wider impact than we ever thought possible in our lives. Let me pray for us. God, I thank you that you're a God that works through so many different things in our lives, that you work through the good times, the mountaintop moments, and the valleys where we've got questions and doubts, and that we can learn more about you in any one of those moments. God, I thank you that you're a God that's not just a God of ideals that we prop up in the corner of the room and say, that's my faith. No, you're a God that's personal and real, and that we can feel, and that we can have a conversation with you, and that we can interact with you, and you interact back in our lives because it's personal and it's real. God, for those of us in the room tonight that we want that, we want to take that step, God, I pray that you can open that doorway, that you can meet us right where we are, whether we're just starting in our faith or whether we're 10 years into it, 20 years into it, that you can meet us at whatever that next step is, that you can guide conversations to happen where they need to happen. God, let that simmer in our minds this week of our questions bringing us closer to you. Let us be brave enough to ask them and be honest with you and each other. We love you. Thank you for loving us. Amen.